Hello and welcome. I am Thomas Porteous and you're watching NewsX World. The US is ramping up its trade fight. President Donald Trump confirms 25% tariffs on goods from Canada and Mexico with no room left for last-minute deals. He's also raising tariffs on China to 20%, sparking immediate retaliation. Canada plans to slap 25% tariffs on billions of US imports, and China announced fresh levies on American goods. Mexico is expected to outline its response soon, as tensions escalate between the US and its key trading partners. We are joined by three guests for this debate. One being Mr. Andrew K.P. Leung, a China strategist located from Hong Kong. We're also joined by Terry Milewski, author and former correspondent for CBC, located in Ottawa, Canada. And we're also joined by Raymond Vickery, former US Assistant Secretary of Commerce, located in Washington, D.C. Terry, I wanted to come to you first on this section I wanted to bring in on Canada and Mexico. Terry, I was wondering, how do you see newly imposed 25% tariffs, 10% on energy products, affecting Canada's core export industries? And what strategies could Canadian companies adopt to remain competitive?
Well, there's no question that it's going to be absolutely ruinous, and that cannot be avoided no matter what the retaliation may be. And we know that the retaliation will be strategic and carefully planned. We've had some experience in Canada, as you know, from the first Trump administration, when he tried similar tariffs, and there were similar strategically targeted retaliatory tariffs by Canada, which were rather cleverly designed. They didn't forget, for example, to put heavy tariffs on bourbon from Kentucky. Oh, who was the Republican leader in the Senate at that time? Oh, yes, Mitch McConnell. Somebody who might have influence over Trump would feel the pain. That's how those tariffs were designed. In the case of aluminum, a very important matter, the tariffs only lasted a year because of these clever retaliatory measures. This time around, more tariffs on aluminum are alleged. Since I'm on that topic, this is a very important one because this is something where this is what trade is about. We can make in Canada aluminum much more cheaply than in the United States because in Quebec there is an abundant supply of hydroelectricity. Huge rivers, lots of dams. We keep the lights on in New York. Well, that's an enormous advantage for American manufacturers, whether they're making cars or F-35 fighter planes. They use that aluminum, and it would cost them much more if they tried to make it themselves without those rivers and without that hydroelectricity. So it's a great advantage to have the existing situation. Putting tariffs on it basically wrecks it. So spread all those examples, like those, small and large, whether it's bourbon or aluminum, across various industries, and then spread them all over the world, and you have an absolutely ruinous trade war, which could probably knock, I don't know, 3-4% off Canada's GDP. Tens of thousands of jobs are at stake. It's going to be an absolute disaster, but significantly, a great number of those jobs will be lost, not in Canada, not in Mexico, but in the United States, because President Trump, I believe, has shot himself in the foot.
Yes. Andrew K.P. Leung, I wanted to bring you in this one. As an external observer of these trade tensions, what lessons do you think China, if any, could draw from the way Canada is managing its trade dispute with the US?
Well, my colleague on the panel just now explained it very well. Of course, this part and parcel of Adam Smith's wisdom, comparative advantage. But unfortunately, Trump doesn't believe in this. And he thinks that tariffs is a beautiful weapon. He thinks that tariffs can even substitute at some point income tax. Well, that's his belief, and he calls himself the tariff man. He wants to bring jobs back to the United States using tariffs, but unfortunately, this is an empty dream because there is no way that a lot of the cheap products can continue to be manufactured in the United States because the costs are hugely very, very high. And even if you add on subsidies, it doesn't make sense to produce a lot of these products in the United States. Plus the fact that the whole manufacturing production ecology has been hollowed out over the years because the United States is focusing not so much on manufacturing, but on finance and capital gains.
Yes.
So that's unfortunately is the reality. But now, as far as China is concerned, of course, China has been got used to this with Trump 1.0 already. And China is much more prepared this time around by growing its own self-sufficiency on technology and by trading much more with the global South. And also, even though goods are not made in China, China's been embedded in it in terms of minerals, in terms of components,
Yes.
in terms of parts. Even though the manufacturing of some of these processes or the production of some of these processes is not located in China. But of course, there is another way China can get around with this. Trump wants to bring investment back to the United States, and China could well locate some of the manufacturing processes to the United States. For example, in the United Kingdom, the famous London black cap is produced by a China-owned company in Coventry called L. Yeah.
So I think that's. So we'll discuss China in more depth in the further conversation. Raymond Vickery, thank you very much for joining us. Trump has brought up two reasons for these tariffs. That's immigration and that's trafficking of fentanyl into the United States. What role do these tariffs play in pressuring Canada and Mexico to address drug trafficking and illegal immigration issues? And how effective might they be in achieving these goals?
Well, thanks for having me, Thomas. Those were stated goals of Trump early on when he first came in, immigration and fentanyl. Of course, immigration has been a key topic in his election campaign and is central to his victory. But the reality is much worse than just trying to achieve something in regard to immigration and fentanyl. In fact, both Mexico and Canada have moved on the immigration problem. Fentanyl is one which is not susceptible to putting troops on the border because of the nature of smuggling. But nevertheless, they have done things in that area. What's going on here with Trump, President Trump, is really much more serious. President Trump has a 19th century view of the world, and that is that great powers make decisions on their own, other people fall in line, and that somehow a fortress America can be built up that will eventually include Canada as a 51st state, get back Panama Canal, get Greenland, and other great powers will do similar things in their own areas. He's already moved to dismantle the international system in regard to Europe, NATO, United Nations, and this is moving on to the WTO. This destroys immediately the U.S.-Canada-Mexico agreement, which was a successor to NAFTA. It, in essence, destroys the World Trade Organization mechanism. Yes. These international mechanisms, which have been built up over time, he wants to substitute for a very different view of the world than we've had for the last 80 years. And it's an extremely serious matter. You can see our Dow Jones has already fallen by over 400 points this morning. And it's the bull in the china shop, the destroy everything and build up something which he considers to be better. But it doesn't augur well for the world. It doesn't augur well for the United States.
Yes.
And exactly the opposite of putting America first.
Terry Milewski, I wanted to just ask you one final question on Canada. In retaliation, Canada is announcing 25% tariffs on US goods worth up to $90 billion. Do you foresee any domestic or international pushback on these retaliatory measures? And how might this escalate trade tensions further?
I'm sure your audience would vastly prefer if I was muted, but thanks for pointing that out. I'm sure that there will be very little pushback against Canada because Canada, like many other countries who are going to be caught up in this whirlwind of stupidity, will be seen as a victim of this sort of bully boy tactics, this sort of crude mercantilism, 19th century as has just been described very ably, is going to hurt everyone, including the United States, as I've already said. But look at one example. Canada has a leadership contest going on to succeed Justin Trudeau as leader of the ruling Liberal Party, and it's been completely turned on its head. From what was considered by pollsters to be an inevitable Conservative victory, the Liberals have finished, and now there's a rally around the flag effect. Where far from complaining about these tariffs, Canadians are refusing to buy American liquor. They're booing the American anthem at sports events. There's a tremendous fighting spirit emerging in Canada, and I don't think there's going to be any pushback at all. In fact, the Conservative leader, who only a month or two ago was anticipating sweeping to power in the next federal election, has been kind of sidelined. What option does he have but to sing on cue in unison with the ruling party? That would be un-Canadian. So I don't think you're going to see any domestic pushback. You will see, I hope, and this is what the whole scheme is designed for, you will see pushback in the United States by American industry and by American workers when they realize that Trump was wrong again, and no, the tariffs are not going to be paid obligingly by the country that is sending us the imports. No, they're going to be paid by the consumer. That is inevitable. That's what happened before. Those are the lessons of history which Mr. Trump sadly refuses to learn. I don't think that the Europeans are going to push back against Canada. I don't think that the Chinese are going to push back against Canada any more than we're going to push back against the Chinese. What's going to happen is that this will all play out as predicted by responsible economists to be a ruin for everybody involved, and much to Mr. Trump's discredit. Then he will declare victory. He will say he did a wonderful job, and he will pretend that his original purpose, which he said was to see American coffers overflowing with gold deposited there by the countries that he thought that he was going to hit with these enormous bills, when it becomes obvious that that is not going to happen, and that nobody suffers, everybody loses, nobody suffers except more than the Americans themselves, then we're going to see, I think, an embarrassing end to this round, much worse than the first round during the first Trump administration, when, as I say, those heavy tariffs on steel and aluminum were withdrawn after a year because it didn't work. But that's another lesson of history that Mr. Trump refuses to learn.
Andrew KP Lung, now I wanted to move on to discussing these tariffs that have been increased by 10% that have been put on China. Andrew, from a let's start thinking from a Chinese point of view. How significant is this escalation from 10 to 20% in reshaping bilateral trade with the US, and how does it affect worldwide trade in general?
Well, as I said, it's more than trade, but even on trade, China is much more prepared this time around. And is, as I said, a lot of the products could well be outsourced to other countries, but even if they have been outsourced to other countries, they have China embedded in it in terms of components, raw materials, parts, and logistics, because the world's top 7 container ports out of the top 11 are located in China. But on the other hand, there is also operations in other countries owned by China, as I was pointing out before, just now. Even in London, all the black caps, a lot of the black caps are now manufactured by a Geely-owned company based in Coventry. It's a CONV. Now, but as I said, it's just more than trade, because it's the whole world order now being upended, as pointed out by Raymond just now, because Trump's worldview is very different. You look at his demands during this first day in the White House. He wants Greenland. You just imagine this map. Greenland is north of Canada, and then you have he wants Canada to become the 51st state, and as also in the Western Hemisphere, Panama Canal, that's in the Western Hemisphere,
Andrew,
and control the Southern Hemisphere. So he wants to make America great again by monopolizing all the resources in the Western Hemisphere and try to do a deal with Russia, and maybe trying to do a deal with China as well. With this reminiscent of what's happening after the Napoleonic Wars, which is known as the Concert of Europe. That's a very old style way of thinking about international relations and politics.
Andrew, just let me come to you with a different question. China has responded with both tariff and non-tariff barriers. Which types of retaliatory measures do you expect to be most effective or strategically valuable for China in the long run?
No, I think that China knows that he's is at the moment holding a trump card in terms of rare earths, and that's why the Trump administration is so uptight about securing more rare earths, not least over Greenland or in Ukraine, and even Putin is offering the rare earth resources in Russia to do a deal with Trump, because the rare earths is not just the material, the substance. It goes into a lot of products, including military products. And I think that China's response has been very targeted, relatively limited, but it's also measured response. But I think that behind it all is the realization that probably Trump is going easier on China. Don't forget that in the beginning, Trump imposed 25% tariffs on its closest allies, but compared with only 10%. But even if it increased to 20%, it's still a little bit less than the tariffs imposed on Mexico and Canada. And of course, Trump the only leader he called during his before his inaugural or during his inaugural was just President Xi. No other leader suggested that and he also wants to visit China within his first 100 days. So that I think that China's adopting quite a measured approach, allowing for the possibility of some sort of a deal in the future.
Yes, Raymond Vickery, I wanted to come to you next, talking about China. How do you assess this decision to increase these Chinese imports from 10 to 20%? And obviously with China imposing 10 to 15% on US agricultural products and restricting American companies, what countermeasures could the US consider without causing further harm to its own economy?
Well, it's very difficult to envision what those countermeasures are. But the problem is here that Trump really isn't viewing this in terms of a trade war. He has a view that he can bring manufacturing back to the United States, and as Andrew has said, there is some scope for that. But he wants to be able to say that America is the great power and has brought this back to the United States in terms of manufacturing and jobs. He has no feel at all for international supply chains. International supply chains are anathema to him. And it is very difficult to see how he gets out of this, except in terms that he understands, and that is of a real estate developer. And that is that he and Xi will make some sort of deal which allocates among these two great powers the advantages and disadvantages, and then that's his view as how it'll to be taken care of. He thinks the same thing in regard to Putin, and somehow he believes that lesser powers like Canada and Mexico are irrelevant to the discussion. So that's the way in which this will be settled, if you will, with China, if at all. My view is that that view of Xi and Trump sitting down, or Modi and Trump sitting down, or Putin and Trump sitting down, and resolving it just does not work in a modern era of international supply chains. But that's what he's aiming for, and that will maybe provide some sort of amelioration, which has been said by Terry. He will say, oh, well, this is a great victory, and I've achieved things that other people couldn't. But of course, that's false. And what he's doing is doing irreparable harm to the international system across the board.
Terry Milewski, with the US raising these tariffs, how might this shift global supply chains? And could Canada potentially benefit from reshoring or nearshoring efforts? And also, how do you think that Canada should navigate its own relationship with China to mitigate negative fallout from escalating US-China tensions?
At the moment, of course, China with Mexico and the United States, I mean, that's 40% of everything that of all Canada's foreign trade. So it's an enormous factor. But on the specific question of supply chains, you're right. There is a significant issue there, considering that the head of Ford Motor Company in the United States has just said, has he not, that the 25% tariffs are going to make a historic blow, a hole in the auto industry, because it's so integrated. And people find this a little hard to understand outside North America, where we have such an integrated, comprehensively integrated auto market. For example, a given part, just a piece of plastic, a lamp cover, a fuse, may cross back and forth across the US-Canada border 3, 4, 5, 6, even 7 times before the final car is put together. Well, that part forms part of another part, which is a bigger part, which then eventually becomes a car. And people fail to understand that. How on earth are we going to sustain an integrated supply chain, North American industry that's integrated, when we have to pay 25% every time that part goes back and forth across the border? It makes a completely absurd scenario. It makes it impossible, in fact, to make any business making cars, which is why the head of Ford Motor Company in the United States is complaining about it. This is going to be a disaster. So I think that that's why I said at the outset that the most significant development that we're going to see is not pushback against tariffs generally, but pushback against the US specifically for causing what will be a worldwide economic disaster. And I don't believe it's going to be quick, because it's going to take a while, as we have seen, for Mr. Trump to back down on anything. He's still not going to get it. The only way to end this is to find a way to paint it as a victory for Mr. Trump, to say that this illustrates his great wisdom, and as a result of the chaos he has caused, we're going to have a new, better world, or something like that. And as long as he gets praise, we can end it. But if we simply sit on television chat panels and bash him, that's not going to do it.
Yes, Andrew KP Lung, I wanted to talk about the broader economic impact of these tariffs now. Andrew KP Lung, how do you anticipate global markets, especially in Asia, will react to continued US tariff actions that also obviously impact Canada, Mexico and China simultaneously?
Well, on the economic front, there is no doubt that it's going to cause a higher degree of inflation to be borne by the consumers. And of course, the American consumer, as pointed out, is going to bear the brunt of all this impact, even though the higher costs are not immediately apparent, but I think will very quickly be felt as Trump lumps on these tariffs and one country after another. Now, with inflation rising, the U.S. interest rates, even though Trump wants to lower the interest rates, but against rising inflation, that would be a difficult issue. And of course, Trump would continue to capitalize on the dominance of the U.S. dollar by printing more money, because the America still enjoys the so-called exorbitant privilege of being able to print money, and all other countries still want the US dollar. But then printing more money again would affect inflation, but also would distract from the reliability of the US dollar as a storage of value. And indeed, with what's going on, more and more countries are beginning to be worried that the American dollar can be weaponized against them. And you can see that a number of countries in the Global South, including Brazil, is going to do a lot of bilateral transactions using other currencies and using digital currencies, or even some barter trade. So I think that there's a great deal of repercussions on the economic front around the world.
Raymond Vickery, as American retailers like Best Buy and Target warn of higher consumer prices, what domestic policy measures, for example tax relief or subsidies, might offset the impact on households if trade tensions persist?
Well, there are ways to try to offset it. Last time, you remember when Trump had problems in his agricultural base, the farmers of the Midwest who could not sell as they had been planning to and had been doing with China. He did provide some subsidies to those farmers, which calmed that down, but it didn't really solve the problem, and really the subsidies will not solve the problems in the longer run, because subsidies have their own impact in terms of distorting markets and increasing inflation. Trump will try to mitigate the impact for political purposes, but as I said, every action has a reaction, and most of the reactions are in favor of raising inflation in the United States. And inflation was one of the two issues which got Trump elected in the first place. So if inflation is exacerbated, he's going to start to lose his domestic base. I only see this thing ending if the Republicans in his party will somehow start to stand up against him. Otherwise, if Trump goes on in this way, the United States is going to be increasingly isolated. It can't happen tomorrow because we're such a great part of the world economy. But over time, people are going to look to China. They're going to look to Europe. They're going to look to other places to try to make up for what the United States has tried to do in terms of creating a fortress America. Hopefully it's not going to come to that, Hopefully there will be mitigation, and eventually Trump will pass from the scene or have to declare victory and recede from his policies. But absent that, inflation is going to increase in the United States, and we're going to be increasingly isolated.
Terry Milewski, Andrew KP Lung and Raymond Vickery, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure. That is all we have time for. We will continue to bring you more news updates from across the world.